A lonely 90-year-old woman in a nursing home asked Keanu Reeves for just one thing. "For today, be my son." He cleared his schedule, held her hand, listened to her life stories, and treated her like family until she peacefully fell asleep, leaving everyone in tears at the quiet kindness of a stranger who became a son for a day. Sometimes, the smallest request can change two lives in ways no one ever planned. This is the story of how a world-famous actor walked into a quiet nursing home and walked out carrying a weight on his heart he never knew was missing. Keanu Reeves had been on set since sunrise. The action scenes were the kind that made people gasp in theaters, motorcycles skidding through empty streets, glass shattering, stuntmen flying. Everyone around him was buzzing, laughing, posting photos. But when the director finally yelled cut for the day, Keanu just felt tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix, the other kind. The kind that comes when you go back to a hotel room that's always too quiet, with no one waiting, no one to ask how your day was. He was heading toward the black SUV when his assistant jogged after him, holding a small, worn envelope. "This came to the studio months ago," she said, sounding almost guilty. "It got lost in a pile. I found it today. It's different. You might want to read it." Keanu almost said, "Can it wait?" But something in her eyes stopped him. He took the envelope. The paper felt thin, like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. On the front, in shaky blue ink, was written, "To Mr. Keanu Reeves, from Rosewood Care Home." He opened it right there in the parking lot under the orange streetlights. Inside was a letter written in a trembling hand. A nurse explained that one of their residents, a 90-year-old woman named Isabel, had one strange, gentle wish. Before she died, she wanted to watch one of Keanu's old movies sitting next to him, like I'm watching with my son again. She had lost that son decades ago, the nurse wrote, and for reasons even she couldn't explain, seeing Keanu on screen made her talk to the TV as if she were talking to him. "We know you're busy," the nurse finished, "but if there is even the smallest chance, it would mean the world to her, even 10 minutes. He read it twice. He could already hear the excuses his team would make for him: schedule, security, image. A visit to a tiny care home wouldn't sell any tickets. No cameras, no interviews, no press, just a fragile old woman and the quiet smell of medicine and dust. He felt the familiar ache of his own losses stirring in his chest, the faces he carried with him everywhere. His friend River, his daughter who never took a breath, the love of his life who never got to grow old. For a second, he wanted to run from that feeling, like he always did, into work, into stunts, into other people's stories. Instead, he heard himself say, "Where is this place?" Rosewood Care Home was on the edge of the city, where the streetlights got lazy and the traffic sounds turned soft. When he walked through the glass doors later that evening, there was no red carpet, no crowd, just a young receptionist who almost dropped her pen when she saw him, and the gentle hum of a television somewhere down the hall. The air smelled like old books and lemon cleaning spray. A nurse in light blue scrubs hurried up, hands wiping nervously on her uniform. "Mr. Reeves." I wrote the letter. I hoped, but..." He smiled, the kind of small, tired smile that still managed to calm people down. "You took the time to write," he said softly. "The least I can do is show up." As they walked down the corridor, a few residents peeked from open doors. One man in a wheelchair squinted and said, "Hey, I know you. You're that guy who never dies in those movies, right?" Keanu laughed, dropped to a knee, and shook his hand like they were old friends. In the dining room, a woman with bright red lipstick insisted he try her secret recipe cookies. He did, right there, crumbs on his black jacket, telling her they were better than any craft services table he'd ever seen. For a few minutes, the home felt lighter. Nurses smiled. A janitor leaned on his mop, grinning. Someone in the distance yelled, "Is it really him?" And another resident shushed them like this was all some delicate dream. Finally, the nurse stopped at a door with a paper butterfly taped to it. "This is Isabel," she whispered, her eyes softened. "She has good days and bad days. Today's been heavy. She talked about her son all afternoon. She thinks today might be her last chance to see him again somehow." Keanu felt something tighten in his throat. He had walked onto 100 sets, faced explosions, fake bullets, impossible stunts. But for some reason, this simple wooden door felt more dangerous than all of that. Before he could overthink it, he nodded. "Let's go in." The room was small but full of life. Photos covered the walls, black and white pictures of a young woman laughing on a beach, a soldier in uniform, a little boy with messy hair holding a wooden toy car. A worn-out television sat in the corner, paused on an old DVD menu of one of his earliest films. In the narrow bed lay Isabel, thin as paper, her hair a cloud of white against the pillow. Her eyes were closed, but when the door clicked, they fluttered open. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if her mind was flipping through memories, trying to place his face in the right decade. "You came," she breathed, more to herself than to him. Her voice was soft but clear. She didn't scream or cry or ask for a selfie. Instead, she studied him carefully, like an artist looking at a painting she'd started a lifetime ago. "You're taller than on the screen," she finally said, a tiny smile touching her lips. "And sadder." The honesty of it surprised him. He pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down, suddenly aware of every scar on his heart. "I get that a lot," he said quietly. Her gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the bedside table. A young man in his 20s, dark hair falling into his eyes, a crooked, familiar smile. He looked so much like Keanu that, for a heartbeat, it felt like looking into a mirror from another life. Keanu picked up the frame, his hands gentler than they ever were around props or stunt wires. "Is this your son?" he asked. Isabel nodded, and for the first time her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. "His name was Daniel," she said. "He used to come home from work and put on your movies, said you understood something about being broken and still standing up." She took a shallow breath. "He never got the chance to grow old enough to look like you do now." Silence settled between them for a moment, thick but not uncomfortable. Keanu felt the weight of all the strangers who had ever watched him in the dark, searching for something, a distraction, a hero, a mirror of their pain. He had never thought about one particular mother somewhere, memorizing his expressions because they reminded her of a son she could no longer hold. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were simple but heavy. "I'm so sorry." Her wrinkled hand reached out, fingers trembling, and he instinctively took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so fragile. She looked at him, not as a star, not as a stranger, but as if some door in her heart had swung open and brought two timelines together. Her lips trembled with words she seemed almost afraid to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, but it cut through him like thunder. "Just for today," Isabel murmured, eyes shining, "will you be my son?" He didn't answer right away. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy at the same time. "Be my son." For a second, Keanu felt like the walls of the small room were closing in, packed tight with every loss he'd ever tried to work through by jumping off buildings and crashing cars on camera. He saw the hope in her eyes, the way her fingers trembled around his, and he knew this wasn't some fan request. This was a woman asking for one last chance to feel something she'd been missing for a lifetime. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. No director was yelling action. No script was telling him what to say. There was just this moment and the terrified little voice inside him that whispered, if you let yourself be her son, you might have to feel like a son again. Slowly, he leaned closer, his hand tightening around hers. "If you're sure you want me," he said, his voice rough around the edges, "then yes, for today I'll be your son." Her eyes closed for an instant, as if she were tasting the words. When she opened them again, there was a shimmer of mischief in the old, tired face. "Then sit down properly," she murmured. "My son never hovered in doorways." He shifted his chair closer to the bed until their shoulders were almost level. The nurse quietly slipped out, closing the door with a soft click that made the small room feel like a world apart. On the TV, the frozen DVD menu still showed a much younger version of him, hair falling into his eyes, trying so hard to look tough. Isabel pointed a thin finger toward the screen. "He used to love this one," she said. "Daniel wore out 2 copies." She fumbled for the remote and nearly dropped it. Keanu caught it midair, grinned, and said, "Looks like I still remember a stunt or two." For the first time, she laughed, an unexpectedly bright sound, like a rusty bell finally moving again. As the movie started, the room filled with flickering light and the distant echo of explosions and car chases. He watched himself sprint across the screen, diving, shouting, doing all the things people praised him for. Beside him, Isabel gave a running commentary that had nothing to do with fame. "He would lean forward right here," she said when a chase scene began. "Bite his lip like this when he was nervous." She mimicked the small habit, and Keanu could almost see the ghost of a young man sitting where he was. "He always said you weren't really acting," she added. "He said, 'Mom, this guy looks like he's been through some things.'" Keanu's chest tightened. He had never met Daniel, but through these scraps of memory, the kid felt real, more real than half the characters he'd played. On screen, his younger self clung to the side of a speeding bus. Off-screen, in this quiet, too-bright room, he sat still and listened like the action was happening in Isabel's voice instead. "Was he right?" she asked suddenly, turning to look at him instead of the TV. "Have you been through things?" The honest curiosity in her eyes left no room for the usual polite answers. He took a breath and nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I've lost people too, people I thought I'd grow old with. Some days acting is just a way to keep moving so I don't fall apart." She stared at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, from seeing a stranger wearing her son's face to seeing another broken human being trying to keep going. "Then you understand," she whispered, "what it's like to have rooms that feel too quiet, to count years by the people who aren't in them anymore." Outside, a cart rattled past in the hallway, muffled laughter rose and fell, life went on. In the little cocoon of dim light and movie sounds, two people who had never met until an hour ago sat side by side, sharing a grief no camera could capture. Halfway through the movie, there was a softer scene, his character sitting alone on a rooftop, battered but alive. Isabel watched it carefully, her breathing shallow but steady. "He always said this part was his favorite," she murmured. "Said it made him feel like it was okay for men to be sad and not know what to do next." Her hand searched for his without looking, and he gave it willingly. "Thank you," she said, "for letting him see that, even if you didn't know." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't do anything," he replied. "I just showed up and tried not to mess up my lines." She smiled faintly. "You have no idea how wrong you are." A soft knock came at the door, and the red lipstick lady from the dining room peeked in, clutching a plastic container. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes wide. "I just thought maybe your son would like a cookie." Isabel's whole face lit up. "Come in, Rosa, this is Daniel." For a heartbeat, Keanu froze at the name, but Isabel said it with such gentle certainty that he didn't correct her. Rosa stepped forward, putting the container on his lap. "If you say no," she warned, "I will haunt your career." He burst out laughing, the tension in his shoulders easing for a moment. He bit into the cookie, crumbs threatening to fall on his jeans again. "You are going to ruin me for craft services," he said. "These are dangerous," Rosa beamed. "He's a good boy," she told Isabel, winking. "You raised him right." Then she left them alone again. The movie rolled on, but neither of them was really watching anymore. Isabel's breaths grew a little slower, a little shallower. Her grip on his hand loosened and tightened in small waves. After a while, she reached for the remote and paused the screen on his younger face, eyes full of desperate determination. "There's something I have to tell you," she said. The light from the TV washed her features in a pale blue glow, making the lines of age and pain look almost delicate. "Before I asked you to be my son, I asked God to forgive me, because—" Her voice wavered, and she pressed her lips together as if to keep the rest from spilling out too fast. Keanu leaned closer, his heart beating a little too loud in his ears. Whatever she was about to say, he could feel that it had been locked up for years, maybe decades. Her fingers tightened around his as if she were afraid he might disappear if she spoke the truth. "Could you ever forgive me?" Isabel whispered, eyes never leaving his. "If I told you that for many, many years I hated you." The word hit him like a punch he hadn't braced for, hated. He had heard criticism before, read headlines, seen strangers pick apart his acting, his life, his expressions, as if he were a puzzle they could solve. But this was different. This was a frail woman in a narrow bed, holding onto his hand like it was the last solid thing in the world, telling him she had spent years aiming her pain right at his face on a movie poster. He didn't pull away. Some instinct deep inside told him that if he flinched now, if he hid behind politeness or jokes, the fragile bridge between them would snap. Instead, he drew in a slow breath and asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" His voice came out almost as a whisper, not from weakness but from respect, for the size of the wound she was about to open. Outside, a storm that hadn't been there an hour ago tapped rain against the window. A gentle, restless drumming that made the room feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. Isabel looked past him as if she were seeing another time entirely. Her eyes went to the photo of Daniel on the bedside table. "He was 23, she began, "too young to know that the night can be cruel." Her fingers traced the edge of the worn frame with a tenderness that made Keanu's chest ache. "There was a new movie of yours in theaters. He had been talking about it for weeks. saved tip money, watched the trailers on our tiny old computer over and over until they froze. She smiled sadly. He kept saying, "Mom, this guy gets it. He looks like he's carrying a whole world on his shoulders and still trying to be kind." She swallowed, the movement in her thin throat slow and strained. Opening night, he drove to the city to see it. He texted me during the trailers, said, "I'm in my seat. You'd hate this crowd, Mom. It's perfect." Her eyes shimmered but didn't drop. After the credits, on the highway home, there was rain like tonight. A truck driver fell asleep, crossed the line. They told me it was quick. The last word broke on her tongue. For a second, her breath stuttered like it might stop altogether. Keanu's hand tightened around hers, steady and wordless. She let the silence sit heavy for a few heartbeats before continuing. "When the police came, there was a movie ticket in his pocket, your name on it, your face on the poster they showed on the news behind the story. I know it wasn't your fault. I know that in my mind, but grief," she gave a bitter little laugh. "Grief doesn't care about logic. It just needs somewhere to point all that fire." Her gaze returned to him, raw and unflinching. "So I gave it to you. Every time your name came on TV, I changed the channel. When I passed your face on a bus stop, I spat on the sidewalk. When people said you were kind, humble, different, I said, I don't want to hear it. If he didn't make those movies, my son would still be here." The honesty of it was like sandpaper on his heart, painful but real. He thought of all the nights he'd gone home from set, showered off the fake blood, and slipped into his own quiet grief, never imagining he was walking through someone else's storm without even knowing it. "And yet," he said slowly, looking around at the TV, the paused frame of his own younger face, the stack of worn DVDs on the shelf. "Here you are, watching my movies, writing me letters, asking me to be your son for a day." His brow furrowed in gentle confusion. What changed? A small, tired smile touched the corner of her mouth. "One night years later, I couldn't sleep. The house was too silent, the clock too loud. I turned on the TV just to drown out the noise in my head." She closed her eyes, seeing it. "One of your films was on. I grabbed the remote to turn it off to throw more anger at the screen. But there you were, sitting alone on some bench, crying for someone you'd lost." She shrugged weakly. "I was furious. I shouted at you, this stranger who had become the shape of my pain. I told you everything I couldn't say to Daniel, that I was angry he left me, that I was scared, that the house was too big without his footsteps." Her voice softened, growing almost reverent. "And the more I yelled, the more I realized I wasn't really talking to you. I was talking to my boy. You were just the doorway." A single tear escaped down her cheek. Keanu reached up and wiped it away with a thumb, careful and respectful, as if he were touching sacred ground. "I kept watching your films after that," she continued. "Not because I forgave you, not yet. But because, somehow, every sad look on your face gave me permission to feel my own sadness without pretending I was fine." His phone buzzed in his pocket, violent and out of place in the quiet room. For a second, the spell broke. He glanced at the screen, his assistant's name flashing, messages stacked. "Call ME, emergency about tomorrow, the studio, the massive stunt they'd been planning for months, millions of dollars, hundreds of people waiting." He could almost hear the arguments, insurance, scheduling, commitments. He looked back at Isabel, frail and burning with a truth she had clearly been building toward for years. Then, without hesitation, he pressed the power button and turned the phone completely off. Her eyes flicked to the small act of rebellion and softened. "You shouldn't do that for me," she said. "You're important. People need you." He shook his head. "Right now," he replied, "one person needs me. That's enough." There was nothing dramatic in the way he said it. No audience, no cameras, just a man quietly choosing to stay. For a moment, she looked like she might cry again, but instead, she gave him a proud, almost maternal nod, as if approving a choice her son had finally made. "I forgave you slowly," she went on. "It wasn't a thunderclap, it was a drip, one scene at a time. One interview where you talked kindly about someone no one else remembered. One rumor about how you gave up your salary so the crew could be paid more. I started to see you not as the man who took my son, but as a man who understood what it meant to lose." Her breathing hitched. "And then one day I realized something that scared me more than my anger ever did. I didn't hate you anymore. I needed you." Her confession hung in the air, trembling. "I needed someone who knew what it felt like to carry ghosts and still get up in the morning, someone who could sit next to me and not try to fix anything." She squeezed his hand, the pressure faint but deliberate. "So when the nurse asked if I had any last wishes, I told her I wanted to watch a movie with you. Not because you're famous, but because I wanted to look at the face that had held so much of my anger and say thank you instead. He felt his eyes sting, the way they had the first time he'd stood at a graveside and realized life was going to keep going whether he was ready or not. "You don't owe me thanks," he said quietly. "If anything, I owe you an apology for all the pain my work accidentally touched." She shook her head immediately, a spark of steel in her voice. "No, you must never apologize for giving people stories. Stories are how we survive. It wasn't your movie that killed my son. It was a tired driver and a bad road. You gave him a last night of joy, of excitement, of that silly way his heart raced when the lights went down." For a long, still minute, they just looked at each other. An old woman who had misplaced her rage, and a man who had spent his life pretending to be unbreakable on camera. The storm outside grew heavier, rain streaking the dark window like the sky itself was remembering something painful. Somewhere down the hall, an alarm beeped once, then settled. Time felt strange, stretched, and thin. A doctor stepped quietly into the room, eyes scanning the monitor by Isabel's bed. His face was kind, but lined with the tiredness of long shifts and too many goodbyes. "How are we doing in here?" he asked gently. Isabel rolled her eyes. "I finally got my son to sit still and you want to take my attention." The doctor chuckled softly, then turned to Keanu with a flicker of surprise recognition that he politely hid. "Her heart is weaker tonight than usual," he said, voice low but not secretive. "We can keep her comfortable, but if there are things you still want to say to each other, don't save them for tomorrow." He left them with that heavy kindness, closing the door behind him. The room felt tighter somehow, the air charged with the weight of now or never. Isabel turned her head back toward Keanu, her eyes clearer than they had been all evening. "I have one more selfish thing to ask," she said, every word careful, precious. "It's bigger than pretending you're my son for a day. It's something impossible, and I need to know if you're brave enough to say yes."